Hi, welcome to Cafe 229. Today, we're very happy and honored to have Dr. Peter Singer. Dr. Peter Singer is one of the Time 100, but most importantly, he's the most influential philosopher of our time. Hi, Dr. Singer.
Hi, it's good to talk to you.
Thank you so much for joining us at Cafe 229. When you grew up, did you inspire to be the most influential philosopher of our time?
When I grew up, I never thought of becoming a philosopher. In fact, I probably didn't know what a philosopher was really for most of my growing up. I think I read my first philosophy book when I was about 16. It was Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. But even then, I didn't think of doing philosophy. Even actually, when I started doing philosophy at university, I still thought I was going to be a lawyer. My older sister was a lawyer. I enjoyed arguing, so lawyers argue for their clients. Seemed like I was well suited to that. And then I learned doing philosophy that actually in philosophy you also argue, but you argue to try to find the truth, not to try to get your client acquitted of the possibly true criminal charges brought against him. And then when I got offered a scholarship to go on with graduate work in philosophy, I thought, yeah, I can do this a bit longer, but it took me a very long time to actually commit myself to say, oh, I'm not going to be a lawyer after all. I am going to have a career as a philosopher. And even then, of course, I didn't really dream that I could be regarded as the world's most influential living philosopher. Whether that label is true or not, I'm not going to say, but I never even thought along those lines.
Well, I mean, the Google said that, so I'm using Google. I'm quoting Google and ChatGPT. I was doing ChatGPT. That's what they say about you.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, ChatGPT must be right.
Well, I'm glad that you did not become a lawyer because that would be a great loss to your thinking and theory. It sounds like when you're young, you say you like to argue. Is that what it meant to be a philosopher, that we have to argue a little bit?
Well, I think that is what philosophy, as I understand it, is really about. It's not learning the history of philosophy. Of course, it's good to know something about the history of philosophy, but if you simply study what other philosophers write and you don't ask yourself, is what they're saying true? Do they have good reasons for believing what they believe? Is their chain of reasoning a sound one? If you're not actually asking yourself that question and thinking about what objections there might be to what they're saying, you're not doing philosophy. If you're just reading them as, I would like to know what Aristotle said, I would like to know what Descartes said, what Kant said, what Bentham said, then you're trying to understand the history of philosophy, but you're not really doing philosophy. So yes, I think argument, reasoning, thinking, discussing, having a dialogue with other philosophers, that is essential to actually doing philosophy.
At least in America, many colleges would require some kind of courses in art of thinking, critical thinking, and that's related to the tradition of philosophy.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're right. Many colleges do require that now, and that's a good thing. I think in the past, they sometimes would rather just teach the history of philosophy without stimulating their students to think. So I think this is progress that we've made, that we understand the importance of teaching critical thinking.
And you are known for utilitarianism. Can you say a little bit about that school of philosophy for some of our audience who doesn't know much about it?
Of course, yes. So utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory. That means it looks at the consequences of your actions and it asks whether the consequences of your actions are good or bad. And essentially, it's saying the right action is the one that produces the best consequences of any of the options open to you. And again, of course, as far as you could tell, because sometimes what looks like it might produce the best consequences does not work out. But as far as you can tell at the time, what you should aim at is doing what will produce the best consequences. And if you're not aiming at that, then you're not doing the right action. Now, the further question is, well, what do we mean by the best consequences? The utilitarian answer to that is essentially to say the maximum amount of well-being or happiness, if you like, that we can produce, and the minimum amount of suffering, pain, misery. So utilitarians will try to avoid causing pain, suffering, misery, and try to promote causing well-being of and happiness, pleasure, those good states of consciousness. That's essentially what the theory is telling us we ought to be doing.
And what kind of example or thought experiment do you usually use to introduce this idea to your students when you are teaching?
Well, there are many different thought experiments that you can give in terms of, if you like, trying to see what their intuitions are, whether their intuitions are utilitarian or not. So there are theoretical examples and there are real world examples. So as a theoretical example, there's what's called the trolley problem. You imagine that there is a runaway trolley coming down a track, and the track is going to go through a tunnel, and the runaway trolley will go through this tunnel, and you know that there are 5 workers working in the tunnel, and there won't be any room for them to jump out of the way of the trolley. So 5 of them will get killed. You can't stop the trolley, but what you can do is throw a switch that will divert it down a sideline where there is one person also in a tunnel who will be killed. So the utilitarian answer there is to say, well, you should throw the switch, because even though that will kill the one person, it's better that only one person should die rather than 5 people should die. And that's a kind of an artificial example, which some people might say no, because then I'm responsible for killing the one person. But the utilitarian says if you have the option of throwing the switch and you don't throw the switch, then you're responsible for the deaths of the 5 people. And that's worse than being responsible for the death of one person, but saving the 5. So that's a kind of a simple, bare bones sort of example. But some of the examples I talk about in the real world relate to things like the fact that we live in comfortable societies where we're relatively well off. We have more resources than we need to meet our basic needs for food and shelter and healthcare and to educate our children and so on. But there are people elsewhere in the world who lack those resources, people living in extreme levels of poverty. So I use an example to get people to think about that situation of a drowning child in a shallow pond. So I ask you to imagine that you're walking past this pond. You see that there is a child who's fallen in. You know that the pond is quite shallow. You could stand up in this pond easily, but this small child can't. And there doesn't seem to be anybody else around. It's, you don't know why, of course. This small child should have a parent or a babysitter looking after them.
Sure.
They're not there. So what do? Well, your first thought is, I should jump into the pond and save the child. And that's not dangerous. What will happen is that I will get wet and I will ruin my clothing, because the pond is going to be, a muddy, shallow pond. I'm wearing really nice shoes. I wouldn't have time to get them off. And maybe I'm going somewhere fancy, so I've got the most expensive clothes on. So there is a cost to you. But if I then ask you to think about, well, would you be justified? Would it be okay to say, this is not my child. I'm not responsible for this child being in a situation where they might soon die. So I don't have to save the child. I could just walk on and ignore the child and forget about the fact that I ever saw this child struggling to stay above the water in this shallow pond. And when I ask people that, overwhelmingly they say, oh, no, you can't do that. You can't
Right.
compare a child's life with the cost of your shoes or your clothing. That would be terrible. So you ought to jump into the pond. And of course, that's exactly what a utilitarian would say.
Mm-hmm.
But the point of the example is that in some sense, we living in affluent countries who are middle class or above and have money to spend on going out to a cafe like you're in now, right, and spending $5 on a cup of coffee, we are in a situation where we can help people in extreme poverty. We can help their children to survive, for example, by supporting an organization that distributes bed nets so they don't get malaria, which is a major killer of small children in some areas, or providing safe drinking water so they don't get diarrhea, which is another killer. I use that example to say, look, utilitarianism has an impact in the real world. And in fact, I think most moralities would say you ought to save the child in the pond. So
Right.
any morality that says you ought to save the child in the pond, I think should also say, and you ought to support some of these organizations that are saving the lives of children, not in front of you, not ones that you can physically drag to safety, but nevertheless, people that you know are in need and who you know you can help through a proven effective organization that is helping people in extreme poverty.
I mean, I think that's a great example. If you believe that you should save that child from the pond, then you should also believe that we all have some kind of responsibility to help the poor. And that leads to, I guess you were also known for effective altruism. That was I guess this is the natural extension from the utilitarian to effective altruism. Like, what can we do to maximize help to others?
Yes, I mean, I certainly think it's true that if you're a utilitarian, you should be an effective altruist. That is, you should want to help other people. You should see that as an important thing to do. And of course, since we all have limited resources, even if you're a billionaire, there's still you have a limit to your resources.
Right.
So you can try to use those resources as effectively as you can to do the most good that you can with whatever resources you can spare for helping people in extreme poverty. So that means that you need to find the organizations that are most effective, that will give you the best value for your donation. Say, save the most lives or prevent people from being blind, restore sight, whatever else it might be. There are many things you can do, but you want to do the most good you can. And so, yes, I got involved in effective altruism in order to enable people to find those effective organizations. And I founded an organization called The Life You Can Save, where people can go online to thelifeyoucansave.org and they can find charities that have been independently evaluated as being highly effective and making the best possible use of your donation to do the most good that you can.
So it's sort of like, I was thinking Amazon, right? The reason why Amazon become popular is it allows us to find what's like the best bang for the buck. So effective altruism is sort of promoting a little bit. It's sort of like having like Amazon style, right? Like there are 10 different ways you can help people, but here are like the most effective way. Sort of like that.
It's sort of like that, yes. I mean, it's yeah, of course, it's sometimes a little more complicated, right? On Amazon, let's say you want to buy a book on Amazon, you maybe can get the identical book from different places. You could buy a second-hand one, which is nearly new, which would be cheaper. So it's a little more complicated, obviously, to assess different organizations, how well they work. They may be doing different kinds of things, as I just mentioned. Some of them may be distributing bed nets to villages where malaria is a killer of children and helping people to use, educating them in how to use the bed net to protect themselves. And others might be restoring sight in people who are blind. Many causes of blindness that are preventable and treatable. So that's another thing you might do. You might help people to start a small business to work their way out of poverty. you might supply them with small amounts of cash so that they can send their children to school. There are many different ways of helping people, and it's not a simple matter to try to compare them all. But that is what the Life You Can Save is trying to do, and some other organizations, an organization called GiveWell too, which is also doing that, to try to really find the best organizations and then inform people about this, because that's a big problem, I think, to giving. I think a lot of people would like to help others, but they just say, oh, there's so many different charities, I don't know which one to give to. Well, that's exactly what the Life You Can Save can help you with.
Yeah, I know. Like sometimes when we purchase stuff, they would just pop up a thing like, would you want to give your change to some organization? You have no idea where that go. Yeah,
that's right.
Can you give us an example on what do you mean by effective charity organization? Like what would be a less effective example?
Right. Well, generally speaking, I mean, if we're talking about helping people, a charity that is working only in an affluent country is going to be less effective per dollar than a charity that's working for people in extreme poverty. And that's not difficult to understand. I mean, suppose that you have $1,000 to give away. Let's say you say, okay, this year I could afford to give $1,000 to a charity if I can really find an effective charity. Where will that make the biggest difference? Well, there are people in poverty in the United States, if that's where you're living. But the poverty line in the United States is something like $24,000 a year, right? Now, if you have $1,000 to give, let's just, to make it simple, talk about giving cash now. I'm not saying that's necessarily the best thing to do, but just for a simple example, if somebody is on $24,000 a year and you give them another $1,000, they're now on $25,000 a year. Is that going to make a life-transforming difference? Now go to a low-income country, somebody who's in extreme poverty as measured by the World Bank. They're on less than $1,000 per year. There's something like $2.15 a day, I think, is the World Bank line of extreme poverty. And there's something like 700 million people in the world below that line. So if you have $1,000 to give to somebody who's earning less than $1,000 a year, you've more than doubled their income for that year. That gives them possibilities that they never could have. Suppose, for example, they live in a hut that has a thatched grass roof, right? Now, this might be an area where they get occasional very heavy tropical rain, and these thatched grass roofs leak, so they don't keep them dry. They may not even be able to protect their food stores, their grain that they're storing from the last harvest, and keep it safe and dry. And also, the thatch needs to be replaced basically on a yearly basis. You need to do it again, and that costs you something. But it costs, something that you might be able to afford. But now suppose you've suddenly got $1,000. You could buy an iron roof, which will last 10, 20 years and will keep you completely dry. So not only is it better, but it's actually saving you money in the long run. But you could never, on your $1,000 a year, have saved up to get enough to buy that iron roof, which may not cost $1,000, but may cost a few $100s. So you're enabling people to do things that they couldn't, or it might be capital to start a small business, right? They might have always wanted to run a little shop, but they could never afford to buy the stock in the shop that they wanted to sell. Now they have that chance. So basically, a charity that is working with people who are very poor will be more effective than a charity that is working for people who are not so poor, and especially in affluent countries where people can often get other things anyway, right? So in the United States or Australia or those countries, there are a lot of things that come for free that do not come for free in low-income countries. Just clean, safe drinking water is one example. In parts of the world, people, it's usually the women, have to walk for an hour or two every day to get water from a river. And then they have to walk back carrying the water. And then the water is not safe to drink unless they boil it. And that means they have to gather firewood to boil the water. Whereas, in affluent countries, everybody can get safe drinking water for free. and they can educate their children for free. Usually they can go to school for free. If they get sick, even in America, which unlike most affluent countries doesn't have universal healthcare coverage, but if you're really poor, you're covered by Medicaid, and you can still go to the hospital. Anyway, you can go to an emergency room. They can't turn you away if you've got a life-threatening condition. So even in America, you have a basic level of healthcare, no matter how poor you are, that people in poverty in other parts of the world just don't have at all.
So it seems like one of your key projects is to connect people who wants to help, who wants to donate to the right organizations, because after all, we may not have the information on who are more effective than others. So your site is providing this kind of information for others.
That's right, and that's one of the wonderful things about the internet. Not everything about the internet is wonderful, of course, but this is one of the wonderful things, that you can put that information online. Everybody can have access to it. I have written a book also called The Life You Can Save, and if you want to read more, you can download that book free from the website of The Life You Can Save as an ebook or an audio book. So yeah, we can put all that information available, and we can keep updating it. You know, the book isn't always constantly updated, but the information about the effective charities, we change that from time to time as we get new information about new charities, or perhaps some other charities turns out to be not quite so good. We can revise that and keep our list up to date. So it's a great resource for people to go to thelifeyoucansave.org.
Man, you're like the Michelin guy for the charity organization. That's very interesting.
It's interesting, as you say. I am a philosopher. I became, I'm interested in all of that, but because I moved towards ethics rather than metaphysics or logic or epistemology, I find that there's a very practical application of the philosophy that I do, and it does things like save lives of people in extreme poverty, help them to see again, or to work their way out of poverty, to have a better life. All of those things are important.
Yeah, I don't think you're just a philosopher. You're also an activist, based on what you just say, because it's a very
That's true. I am, yeah, and actually not only about global poverty, because I've also done a lot of work about treatment of animals. I think that we have we have an attitude to animals that is really, in a way, almost like the attitude of white people in the 18th and 19th century to slaves. That we think of somehow that we're entitled to enslave animals, and the worst form of enslavement is to raise them in these enormous factory farms where we have tens of thousands, sometimes even millions of animals locked away in sheds, and we're just crowding them together to produce their flesh or their eggs or their milk at the cheapest possible price, without really giving any thought for their welfare. So I'm also an activist in trying to persuade people to change that. I think that the Buddhist tradition is actually much better than the Western tradition in terms of compassion for all sentient beings. But even, I noticed when I was in Taiwan, although there are certainly some vegetarians there, and I had some great vegetarian meals when I was in Taiwan, but not everybody is a vegetarian, and so I think Buddhism needs to be put into practice in those aspects rather more than it is.
Yeah, well, definitely not all Buddhists are vegetarian. That's definitely true. And I think it's, I think one of the challenge in terms of knowing what's the right thing to do. So, for example, I know this is the right thing to do for animal, for the poor, or even for myself, right? Let's say we know exercise is good for us. But the challenge here is, even though you know it's the right thing to do, but it's still hard to do sometimes.
Right. Well, some things are harder to do, yes. I think partly, for me, I became a vegetarian about 53 years ago. And thinking back to that time, it wasn't that I loved meat so much that it was hard for me to eat other dishes. There's lots of other delicious things to eat. It was more in a way the social, almost, I would say, almost an embarrassment of saying to people if they invited me for dinner, oh, I'd love to come for dinner, but I don't eat meat. And then at that time, especially I was living in England then, people would say, well, what else do you eat, right? They wouldn't know what to cook for a vegetarian. Now, things have improved since then. There's much more awareness of vegetarian and even vegan cooking and eating, and there are a lot more products around and a lot more people who don't eat meat. But I think for some people that's still a problem, that they don't want to be fussy about their food. And this is being fussy. This is a serious ethical issue. And so I think we should speak up and say, look, I don't want to eat these things that come from animals who've been abused and maltreated and suffered in horrible ways, just so that I can eat their flesh rather than, some delicious alternative. Like, as I say, there's plenty of great dishes from all cuisines. I'm very fond of Asian cuisines and of like stir fries with tofu or with mushrooms or a whole variety of things. There's a lot of great bean dishes. So there's plenty to eat. It's not that difficult when you think about it.
Well, Taiwan definitely have a lot of vegetarian restaurants. When you teach, how did you encourage your students to be, let's say, on a plant-based diet, or encourage them to protect animal, not to use animal product? Like how do you encourage them? Let's say the kid come to take your class.
Well, as a teacher, I have a responsibility to get them to think critically, right? It goes back to what we were talking about at the start of this discussion. I don't want to just indoctrinate them into one particular view. Right. So if I teach about the ethics of how we treat animals, which I always have done, I will give them some things that I've written to read. I've written a book called Animal Liberation, which I updated last year to a version that's now called Animal Liberation Now. And I will give them maybe the first chapter of that to read, but I will also give them critical works from people who disagree with my views about that. And then they will break up into small discussion groups, because if I teach a class on practical ethics, it may have 200 people in it. You can't have a good discussion in such a large class, but we will break up into discussion sections of about a dozen, sometimes with me, sometimes more often with graduate students who are taking them. And then they can discuss those different readings, and they can come up with their own views, and they can write their papers. And the papers will be graded on the basis of how good is the argument, not whether they agree with the professor taking the course or not, because that's my responsibility as a teacher. But of course, I also believe that the arguments against eating meat, certainly against eating meat from factory farmed animals, are very strong. And so I think that exposing people to both sides of the argument will lead those who are thinking clearly and concerned to live ethically to a more plant-based diet. And I've seen that happen in, obviously not in all of my students at all, but in some of my students that has definitely happened.
Yeah, you wrote the book since 1975, right? How do you feel about the progress so far?
Yeah, the first edition of Animal Liberation came out in 1975. Progress so far? Well, it's mixed, I would have to say. As I was just saying earlier, there is much more awareness of animal ethics. There was really no animal rights movement in 1975 at all. There was some like Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, but they were mostly focused on cats and dogs, and perhaps horses. They were not concerned about chickens or pigs in factory farms. So that's changed. It's great that there are these organizations like People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, like the Humane League, Mercy for Animals. There's big organizations advocating for farmed animals, not just dogs and cats. That's great. There have been some changes in the United States, some states that have had ballot initiatives like California, Oregon, Washington State, have had some progress, in at least banning these very small cages where animals can't even turn around or walk a step freely, or hens laying eggs can't even stretch their wings. And that's also happened in Europe. In fact, I think Europe is far ahead of the United States. In the whole of the European Union, these cages for egg-laying hens have been banned, whereas in the United States, it's only in a few states that they're banned. So there has been progress, and that's encouraging. But the big but is that there is actually more meat eaten globally now than there was in 1975. And that's partly because of more prosperity in some countries. China is the biggest and most important example here. As China has become more prosperous, people have more money to spend, and they spend some of that money on meat. So whereas China ate very little meat when it was a poorer country back in the 1970s, now it's much more meat. And to produce that meat, China is entirely gone into factory farming on a vast scale. 26-story buildings just filled with pigs on every floor. So this is a really bad situation. And actually, I'm going to China next month. In October, I will be giving talks in many different cities in China, from Beijing, Xi'an, Chengdu, Wuhan, Shanghai, Jinan, Guangzhou. So I will be traveling a lot and talking about issues about animals. And I'm hoping to encourage more people in China to think about the ethics of what they eat, and also encourage the universities to offer more courses in animal ethics, so that their students can start thinking about these issues too.
Yeah, I hope you make a change there. And I also think that certain countries now, they're doing better, but they also end up using more fossil fuel, or they end up using more like resources. And is this something you will also talk about with them when you're out there?
Yeah, I think in the lectures that I'm giving, I will talk a little bit about questions like climate change. That's not the major focus of what I'm talking about. I think China is aware of the issue of climate change. I think pretty much every government in the world is aware of that issue. They're just not doing quite enough. But China has certainly had a significant impact because it's producing most of the panels for solar electricity, which are used worldwide. And obviously, the cheaper that those panels become and the more effective they are at converting sunlight into electricity, the better they compete with electricity from fossil fuels, and that's a good thing. And China is also producing cheaper electric cars, which also will help to reduce fossil fuel consumption. So I think, China is, like many countries, is doing something positive in this area. The issue is it enough? Is it doing enough positive to actually avoid catastrophic climate change? And at the moment, I think the answer is no. Globally speaking, we are not doing nearly enough. This is a very serious issue. We are already seeing dramatic changes in the climate. This northern summer was the hottest summer ever recorded. And that's something that has been happening, progressively. If you look at a chart of which are the 10 hottest years ever recorded, they're all in the 21st century, right? Since we've started keeping weather records back into the 19th century, none of those years has been as hot as the average years in the 21st century.
I think like animal rights, global warming, poverty are all sort of the examples on how utilitarianism can be applied to real world problems, if I understand correctly.
That's correct. That is correct. Absolutely.
Yeah. Have any of your students or someone mentioned to you about like judo?
The martial art.
Yeah, because the key principle of judo is very much like utilitarianism. Maximum efficiency with minimum energy and mutual benefit for self and others.
Okay, I'm aware of judo, of course, as a martial art or a sport or a practice. But in terms of the philosophy behind it, no, I suppose I knew this thing about maximal efficiency and use of your energy and how you use your opponent's energy to unbalance them and so on. But the idea that this is for mutual benefit is not something I was aware of.
Yeah, and you apply that. So you practice that principle with your physical opponent, but then you apply that in real life. So that's why I found it interesting. That I myself, as a judo players, I was like, oh, that I see some similarity.
So there's a whole philosophy of life that goes with judo. You're saying it's not simply learning the movements.
Right, that's correct. One last question. One interesting question I have is really mental health perspective, because I'm a mental health professional. Have any of the psych faculty in your university back then want to do research with you on psychology and, let's say, effective altruism? Did anyone look at this kind of relationship or benefits?
Yes, there are certainly asked people in psychology doing work about altruism and a whole lot of different areas of altruism that people are working on. I've actually co-authored papers that have been published in psychology journals. Two of those papers were about the effect of teaching on students' diet. I was able to take part in. I wasn't the principal author of the papers, but I was involved in studies in which we randomized groups of students to either have a discussion about the ethics of eating meat or have a discussion about giving to charity. And the group that had the discussion about giving to charity was the control group, because we couldn't actually measure whether they did give more to charity or not. But we could measure the students who were in the meat group, because at this university, which was the University of California at Riverside, the students used their ID cards to purchase meals at the university cafeteria. And we got ethics committee approval to get that data anonymized, but still get the data, so that we could say, yes, the students who were in the meat discussion ordered fewer meat dishes at the student cafeteria over a period of several months than the students who were in the charity class. So that was an interesting study with, using the methods of research psychology about the impact of teaching. So that's some work that I've done together with others. But there is work on altruism generally. There's some interesting work about people's attitudes to animals and the way that they're affected by meat. Somebody at the University of Melbourne, I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, Australia now, somebody there did studies in which they asked people questions about their views about animals and, how intelligent are the animals, how sensitive are they, what kind of responses would they have to certain situations. And then, again, randomly dividing them, half of them were told that they were going to have a beef hamburger for lunch, and half of them were told that they were going to have a vegetarian lunch. And then they were given some other exercises to do in between, but then they were again asked their opinions about animals. And the ones who were told that they were going to have a hamburger now had a lower opinion of the capacities of cows than they did before, whereas the ones who were told that they were going to have a vegetarian meal had no change. So it's interesting how we alter our perceptions of what animals are like because of the fact that we are thinking about that we're going to eat them.
This is a great examples on how, because I'm interested in how to influence people's thought process. I mean, it's one thing we know what's a good thing to do, but it's another thing to move us from thinking to behavior, right? We know smoking is bad, but to stop smoking, there's a process to that. So I was thinking the same thing. Altruism is a good thing, we all agree, but how we move from someone who's not altruistic to altruistic behavior.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I have done some work about also with some psychologists about what kind of arguments move people to give to charity. It's a little more difficult to test that, but we did do some work on that.
Great. Well, it was such a pleasure to have you with us. What would be a good take-home message for us to encourage us to be a bit more altruistic?
Well, my take-home message is that I think being more altruistic is actually good for us as well. I think that there's a harmony between being generous, being outward, being compassionate and concerned about others, and feeling fulfilled, feeling that your life is meaningful and worth living. And I think that's really important to our levels of personal happiness and satisfaction. That we don't just think, oh, I'm getting pleasure because I'm having great food or great sex or whatever else it might be. I'm on a vacation in a beautiful tropical island. We really want to feel that our lives are meaningful. And I think that being altruistic, thinking about others, has this sort of rebounding effect. That we're not altruists just because we want this effect, but it does actually have this byproduct of making our lives better.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singer. It was such a wonderful time to spend with you. We're really happy to have you with us on Cafe 229.
You're very welcome.
I hope you enjoy our conversation. If you want to find out more about Dr. Singer's work, please check out his website. Thank you again for watching.